All right, welcome back, folks. We are going to continue right where we left off in the last video. No idea what video number this is, but in this particular part, we are going to focus on actually building out the view to display a list of characters. So before we jump into things, drop a like down below, hit subscribe if you're new here, comment for that algorithm, and let's dive right in. So at the end of the last video, we were able to actually make an API call and get some results out in our character view controller. What I'm going to want to go ahead and do now is start thinking a little bit about what this view is going to look like, maybe start creating some view models, etc., etc. So that being said, let's actually talk through it because I haven't scripted or planned any of these videos. So I probably want to see a nice spinner here as the request is in flight to start fetching the actual characters. And once we have actually gotten the characters back, what I want to go ahead and do is show perhaps a list that can scroll or maybe a grid of characters. Instead of using a list, I think it'd be kind of cool if we had more prominent images. So I want something like a grid. So when dealing with having something like a grid, what we want essentially is a UI collection view. So what I'm going to go ahead and do is take this code we previously wrote to fetch a character, and we're going to move it, or a list of characters, I should say. We're going to move it into another object. Now, that other object is going to be a view model. So a view model essentially is the binding between a view, our controller, as well as any business logic between the view and the model. So let's open up this view model folder, and I'm going to create a new file in here. And we're going to go ahead and call this, we don't want to create a UI view. We want to create just a Swift file. So let me try that again. We're going to create a new file here, and this is going to be a character list view model, and notice the word view is duplicated. That is in fact intentional. So character list view model. Let's go ahead and create it. This is going to be a struct, and we're going to say character list view model, like so. And we can go ahead and create maybe a function in here that is something along the lines of fetch characters. And we can paste whatever we had in our controller directly in here. Now, the reason we're doing this is we want our controller to be as minimal as possible. And essentially, I'm going to do my best to create every view model, and all these objects with single responsibility separately, such that we can actually keep this nice and nimble in terms of our controller sizes. Now, like I mentioned, we want to have a spinner, and then we want to show a collection view. So doing that, we could do it directly inside of the controller, but it might get a little messy. So rather, what I'm going to go ahead and do is I'm going to create a dedicated view, which I'm going to call a character list view, which is why I prefixed it for our view model. And we're going to toss it into the views folder. So this is going to be a Cocoa Touch class. We're going to subclass from UI view, and this is going to be a character list view. And right off the bat, I'm going to finalize this class, meaning no one can subclass it. We'll get rid of all this junky template code, and I am going to add some comments on here. I'm going to say view that handles showing list of characters, loader, and I'll just do etc. for whatever else we end up tossing in here. So let's go ahead and actually override the initializer here. And in here, all I'm going to do is two things. So number one, we are going to say translates auto-resizing masks into constraints is false. We're going to want to also override the required NSCoder initializer and simply say unsupported in here. And I'm also going to change the background color of this to, I don't know, some random color. I'll stick with system blue, just so we have something. The next thing we're going to do is actually add this view in our character view controller. And the way we do that is by saying private let, and we'll call this a character list view, will be our character list view, like so. We are going to go ahead and say add this as a subview, and we want to actually have the instance of it, so make sure you copy and paste correctly. And for this guy, we can actually say character list view, we want to set up some constraints so we can actually see this view. So if you're not familiar with constraints, we're essentially going to say pin the view to the top of this controller, the left, the right, and the bottom. And this is going to help us make sure this looks really nice on all different phone sizes or even iPads. And we'll get into the iPad bit after several more videos. So we'll say top anchor is a constraint equal to view, safe area layout guide, not insets, safe area layout guide, top anchor. I'm going to copy and paste this a total of 4 times. And we're just going to adjust this to left, right, and bottom. And respectively, don't forget to change it over here. Now, if I go ahead and just do build and run, we should see a red screen here, or blue, I guess, which is what I made it. Now, the reason it's blue is because we have taken this view and we have actually tossed it and pinned it. So if I actually rotate this, you'll see everything still looks pretty nice. Nothing is cutting off, even though the title bar up here, the navigation bar, has adjusted. Now, this view is going to actually have all of our UI logic, right? Showing the spinner, it's going to hold on to an instance of our view model. This controller is going to serve very little purpose here. So let's go ahead and jump into this view and let's start talking about what we'll actually need in here. So we are going to want our view model. So I'm going to go ahead and say private let view model will basically be the view model object we created earlier. So we'll just instantiate it like that. And one thing I'll also call out is you'll notice that I'm privatizing things as we go along. So a good rule of thumb is if you don't need it to be public, just make it private. So a lot of people will just make it internal, which is basically not having anything, but you're way better off just properly using the appropriate access control right out the gates. So let me actually get rid of the background color on here. And we're going to talk about what elements we need. So we are going to want a collection view and we are going to want a spinner. So let's take a jab at the spinner first and foremost. So this is going to be a UI activity indicator view. We're going to create it with this block pattern, which we'll use very often in our project. It's called an anonymous closure. And I'm going to go ahead and create it like so. And the style we're going to go ahead and use is large. I'm simply going to return it. And the only thing we want to do on here is, well, there's 2 things I should say. There is going to be hides when stopped, we'll say is true. And we are also going to say translates auto resizing mask into constraints, which we'll want on any view we want to use with auto layout. Now we do want to add this as a subview. So I'm going to go ahead and say add subview, and we actually don't need view because we are already in a view. And we're going to add a separate function here, which is going to say add constraints. And what we're going to do is add all of our constraints in here. So we'll say ns layout constraint. We're going to activate some constraints and we'll go ahead and add a couple of constraints. Particularly, I want this to be 100 points wide and 100 points tall. And then we just want this to be centered in our view. So I'll go ahead and say center x anchor will be constraint equal to center x anchor of its parent, which is the current view. And then we'll do the same thing for the y anchor. And finally, we want to make sure we don't forget to call this function. We'll call it at the bottom of our initializer. And then I will also go ahead and say for the spinner, we're going to say start spinning. I think that's a function on here. There we go. Start animating is what I'm looking for, actually. So let's go ahead and give this a build and run, and we expect to see a spinner in the middle of our screen, which in fact we do, which is awesome. So now that we actually do have our view set up here in terms of our spinner, we want to actually kick off the request to go and get our data, which is our first set of characters. Now, if you recall, in this view model, we tossed in this function, fetch characters. So I can simply go ahead and say here, view model, fetch characters. Now, once we have characters back, we expect to have the view, A, get rid of the spinner, and B, show some sort of grid of characters. So we first need to create a couple things here. We need to create the grid. We need to create a way to notify the view that, hey, something has changed here. We've got some data. And let me actually do that iteratively. So the first thing we'll create here is a collection view. Now, collection view helps you model a grid of views. It could be equal sized grid where each box in the grid is an equal size. You can play with the layout, but we're going to try to keep things a little simple. So we're going to create a layout here, which will be a UI collection view flow layout is what I'm looking for. We are going to create and return a collection view here. So we'll say let collection view is going to be a UI collection view. And we'll create it with a frame of 0, a collection view layout of layout. And similar to the spinner up above, we're going to say translates auto-resizing masks into constraints is false. And collection views are special. We want to register the particular cell that we want to show for each of the grid basically nodes, right? For each box, what do we want to show? For now, we're just going to register the base cell, and we're going to talk about custom cells in another video since it gets kind of long, and we'll give it an identifier of cell lowercase. So now that we've got this good to go, the other thing we want to do is we want this to be hidden by default since we're fetching data, and there's no reason to show some weird view if we're showing the spinner. Once the spinner goes away and we have some data, then and only then do we want to make this visible. Now, I'm also going to want to animate this in nicely, so I'm going to go ahead and set it to alpha to 0, which is its opacity. So let's go ahead and actually add this as a subview. So I'm going to first add the collection view and then the spinner, and I'll talk about why I'm doing that. Now, one thing you'll notice here is that this add subview takes a singular element, but I want a custom function which is add subviews, because it's kind of annoying to have to do add subview each time. So that brings us into an extensions file that I'm going to go ahead and create under resources. And inside of here, we're going to be able to extend the functionality of some of the base classes that Apple offers. So we're going to import UIKit, and we are going to write an extension on UIView. And this is going to be add subviews, and this is going to take either a collection of views, or in our case, we're going to use something called variadic parameters, where you can do UIView ... and we can simply say views for each. We just want to say self add subview singular $0, and we actually don't even need self there. So now if we jump back to our view that we've created, you'll see that this is now a valid function. So if I try to build by doing Command B, it should say build succeeded. So let me go ahead and build and run and make sure nothing's crashing, nothing weird's going on, which is great. Nothing is. We see our spinner. And let's go ahead and start talking more about this collection view. Now, one thing we haven't done is we haven't actually set up its constraints. So let's go ahead and do so. It's actually going to have quite similar constraints to what we did in the character view controller with the character list view. So I'm going to be a little lazy and copy and paste it, and we'll adjust it. So cool, so we're going to put that there. We're going to change each of these to be the collection view, like so. And we want to pin this basically to the top left and bottom of the screen. So we don't actually need the safe area layout guide thing. We can get rid of that. We just want the collection view to be pinned to each side of its container, which is basically the entire screen. So once you do that, you should be in good shape. If you build, everything should look great. If you run, you're not going to see anything because it is in fact hidden. So the next thing we want to do is a collection view can take a delegate and a data source. The data source is kind of self-explanatory. It's how you provide data to your particular view, which is a collection view. The delegate is to handle events with the view. So in this case, tapping on a cell. So if we have a list of characters, when we tap on a character, we want to open up another screen to actually go and see details about said character. So what I want to do in this video is let's at least get our data source working so we can actually kind of understand what's going on here. So let's make sure we stay reasonable about function size. Let's create a new function, and we're going to say set up collection view, and we're going to do this down here. We're going to say private func setup collection view. And we can go ahead and actually say here that the collection view is going to have a delegate, and the collection view is also going to have a data source. Now, we can specify self here, or we can have our view model conform to these protocols and actually specify that, hey, I'll be the data source as well as the delegate for the particular the particular collection view. So I'm going to come into here, and we are going to extend UICollectionView data source. Let's try compiling and see what happens. Well, first and foremost, it can't find the type. It's because we need to import UIKit. The second thing is if we try to conform again, it says non-class type character view model can't conform. Okay, so it needs to be a class. So let's make a class, but it's still yelling at us. And the reason it's yelling at us is because it expects this class to inherit from NSObject. Okay, so we've gone ahead and done that, and it's still yelling at us because we don't actually conform to the protocol. So let me go ahead and conform to that protocol down here. I'm going to actually do it in an extension to keep our code nice and clean. Now, I will call out that it is a little subjective on design patterns if you should have the view model be the data source, if it should be the controller, who's responsible for actually supplying the data to the view. Could be the view model, could be the controller. In our app here, we are going to, in fact, be the view model. So we're going to say this extends the data source protocol, and we're going to implement the bare number of functions for now. We'll just return maybe, 20 to mimic what the API gives us. And we are also going to go ahead and say cell for item at index path. And this is where you need to dequeue and return a single cell. Now I do realize I'm glossing over a lot of details here just to get something in this video to show up, and then we're going to make sure we dive deeper along the way. So we're going to say collection view, dequeue a reusable cell with the identifier we registered for an index path. I'm also going to go ahead and say that we want to return the cell. And for now, let's just set a background color on it of perhaps system green. If you compile, shouldn't have any issues. Let's come back to our view, and pro tip, if you have a trackpad, you can two-swinger swipe back to the previous file. And here we can see the data source is our view model. And it won't actually complain because we do actually conform to that particular, the particular data source protocol that is needed. So we'll also come down here, and after perhaps a delay, we're just going to simulate. And don't worry about this particular code. After a delay, we're going to say, go ahead and get rid of the spinner and show the collection view. So we're going to say maybe after 2 seconds, now plus 2 seconds, we're going to do a couple things. We're going to say spinner.stop animating, which should automatically hide it as well. The other thing we're going to do is we're going to say self.collectionView.isHidden is false, and self.collectionView alpha is going to be 1, but we want to animate this in. We want it to be nicely fading in. So we're going to say UI view animate with duration is what I'm looking for here. And maybe we'll say 0.4. We don't really want to delay on here. And then our animation is going to be set the alpha, aka opacity, to 1. So let me go ahead and give this a build and run, and let's see what the heck this looks like. So there's our spinner. It goes away, and beautifully like so, our collection view loads in. Now, the last thing that I want to briefly touch on is the cells here are totally inappropriately sized. If we do this, right, the size of the characters will be super small. We probably only want 2 columns here. So how on earth do we fix that? So what we want to do is 2 things. I'm going to go ahead and assign the delegate to the view model for the collection view. We are also going to conform to that here. We're going to say UI collection view delegate. And I'm also going to go ahead and say UI collection view flow layout delegate, or delegate flow layout is what I should say. Now, by doing so, we get access to another function, which is, I believe, called size for item at index path. And we can actually specify a size. Now, there's a couple ways you can go about doing this. I'm going to do one kind of tricky or clever way is what I should call it. We want to specify a width and a height for this particular cell. And instead of using constants, because the width of every iPhone and iPad is different, we're going to get the size of the entire device. And the way we do that is by saying we want the bounds of the current screen, main, and we want the bounds of it. And what we can now do is we can perhaps say that we'll have a 10-point margin on the left and the right, and maybe 10 in the middle as well. So we can go ahead and say, take the bounds and subtract 30 and then divide that whole thing by 2. And we know that this should be the width, right? So we'll go ahead and actually call this width. Now we want this to be a card where the height is maybe width, and we're going to multiply this by, let's do 1.5, and let's see what that looks like. And we shouldn't have a problem here. Let's see what the problem is. This is saying can't convert this because we want bounds.width is what I'm looking for. And if we go ahead and give this a run, you'll now see that the cells should be way more appropriately sized. And we actually scroll up and down, things are looking good. The only thing that kind of looks strange right now is we don't really have margin on the left and right. We're actually flush up against the edges of the device. So let me add that margin and then we'll call it a video. So let's jump back to our view. Let me close this models folder so we don't need it. What I'm going to do is we're going to specify that margin, which is called inset on the layout. So the layout lets you control a couple of things, such as scroll direction, which is vertical by default, but it also lets you control things like the section inset. So we're going to say UI edge insets. We're going to have a top, left, bottom, and right. Top and bottom, 0, left and right, we'll do 10. And let's see what we get. So we have characters here. We've got these really nice looking cards. No shadow or anything going on quite yet. We're going to talk about that in a later video, but we're in pretty good shape. We have these 20 cards here. Now, admittedly, we have actually hard coded them, but the point being is that we can now have a view model that fetches data. We have a basic view, which has, a lot of stuff going on in it, but admittedly, it's very separate from our controller. And everything is nicely self-contained. Now you can also go, pretty wild, and you can move this to its own function. We can say setup view, and I'll toss this down here. This will be another function called setup view. And essentially that's, the extent of the controller. So we made it pretty far. That is all I'm going to do in this video. Appreciate y'all watching. Drop a like if you haven't done so yet. Hit subscribe if you're new here and into iOS. Comment for that algorithm and share the series with anyone who would be interested. I'll see you in the next part.